I'm going to tell you, life's a team sport. I don't think that anybody here is going to require any convincing of. But how do you build those teams? Clearly, it's important in terms of delivering a fine product. But it's also important for our personal ability to deliver within the team. How do we create those feedback systems where somebody can pull you aside and say, I think you're not doing something right here. What's going on deeper in your life? How do you forge a relationship where you can say, everything's going on great in my life, as Michelle was talking, but what was it? What was that key piece that allowed you to connect with Greg, right? Something transformative happened there. There were plenty of people in her life, but this is the one that left that door open. So that's what I want to spend a little bit of time on. In my background, I was an athlete myself, and I really think, as has been pointed out, that sports, recreation, athletic opportunities, the cultural opportunities are huge. As Maurice pointed out, whether it's you're talking about race relations, you're talking about Title IX and giving opportunities and equity to women, like we just saw with our national soccer team, and even economic equity there. It is a realm that's ripe for it because you've got competitors leaping into it. So we really have to advantage it to take on some of these much seemingly larger cultural issues. But we're also preparing these young athletes to have the resilience to take on these things. So I think there's a cultural piece here. I think there's a really kind of a resilience piece here. And I also think that there is a need to recognize that there's a huge emotional piece here. And I most of my career at the FBI, I spent as a crisis negotiator, 16 years, really meeting people and a fair amount of personal experience of meeting people in their worst situation. And you can learn a lot about that. And the first thing that I like to draw out of folks about crisis and about conflict is that they can be really formative, but the choices about whether they're formative or not are actually made long before the crisis. And we know this because it is directly related to athletic training. This notion of like, hey, I'm training for something, so I'm going to practice something. So you've heard a lot about the physical aspects of training. And we're all bought into that, right? There's great data here that says, hey, this is what you should do. We can tell our athletes, hey, there's nutrition here. All this stuff really is very, very rational. The truth is that we are actually completely irrational. As beings, we are irrational. There was a point I was just going to make there with a crisis. First is that we have one thing that we always can control. We always can control in a crisis. And what is that? That's right. It's yourself. You get to own your reaction. Now, what I'm going to submit to you is you only get to own that reaction, just like in athletic training. You only get to own that reaction if you've prepared for it. So what happens in a crisis is actually decided in advance. So if it comes to setting a block in it's trained, right? I know I'm going to cut left. The play says this. If I see the guy line up that way, I'm going to cut left. It's muscle memory, right? And even the picture of the guy leaping over the guy, right? As was rightly pointed out, that didn't just happen in a vacuum. That was trained, athletic capacity that was given a context that he saw it as an opportunity to use athletic training that he had already had. It wasn't that it happened in a vacuum. In fact, no human behavior happens in a vacuum. It's all learned, trained, and perishable if we don't use it. So the point of this in crisis is that there is a huge emotional element here that we have to recognize, we have to identify. If people are hurting, as Maurice rightly points out, We have to find it. We have to create the right opportunities, both the time, the space, and the right attitude for somebody to say something. And so that empathy piece is really huge. So when I know a fair amount about crisis, I'm going to dive into just why and how it relates to my own athletic experience. When I was 20 years old, I was the captain. I was the two-time captain of the Illini swimming team. If you met me in my 20s, I was wearing swimming T-shirt. I was about swimming. I wanted to talk about swimming. I was always training swimming. I wanted to be known as a swimmer and as a good swimmer. And I was doing all the right things to make that happen. In 1988, unrelated to anything I'm doing, a deranged person is planning the first school shooting in America. And it takes place right here on the North Shore. And America experiences its first lockdown. And it wasn't practiced, it just happened. Well, what happened is this deranged person went and attacked the community, set fire to a home, sent poisons out around the country, tried to ignite a cyanide gas device that would have killed dozens, maybe hundreds of kids in a school. It culminates with her going to a second grade classroom in Winnetka, Illinois, and opening fire on second graders, shooting 6 and killing 1. And in the course of her escape, she crashes her car near my childhood home. I'm home with my folks just the night before from school, and she comes into our house with guns, and we've got a hostage situation. So for an hour and a half, I'm in a crisis that I have no context for. I'm a swimmer. Nobody's crisis trained me. I don't know anything about police or guns or anything. And we are working with somebody who is at a very, very high level of emotionality, who's done something incredibly terrible that we know nothing about. And my mother deploys some empathy by saying, "Who are you? What happened? Are you okay?" She gives her some clothes to put on. And we are able to bring the threat level within that situation down a lot. And I'm able to negotiate my folks out, and I'm left with an opportunity to disarm her. It doesn't go as well as planned. I'm a way better swimmer than I am a gunfighter, and I'm shot in an attempt to disarm her. The bullet rips through my chest, goes through both of my lungs, my esophagus, my pancreas, my stomach, and it gets lodged in my left lat, which was kind of funny because I had pretty big lats back in the day because I was a swimmer, but we weren't really focused on much core work at the time. So I actually joined core power lately, and I've got a whole new focus on my core. But and I took a lot of ribbing about that from my team when I eventually returned to them. But what happened is, to make that story very short, I escaped the house, and she took her own life in an upstairs bedroom. And this became kind of a very famous blip on the screen here in the Chicago area, and was kind of a grim foreshadowing of a challenge and a crisis that we are still grappling with that is not unrelated to the mini crises of building relationships that you are really at the forefront of, both from a parent standpoint, but particularly at the coaching standpoint, of pulling people in and building teams and communities where people can feel safe enough to take risk, to try something new, to fail, to say what's going on. But there's some skills there that allow for that to happen. So let me just kind of digest for you a bit of some lessons that I've learned from not only that incident, but from 16 years as a crisis negotiator and working with folks that are in crisis and having a few crises that I've created on my own. I've got kids and a wife to attest that I've created quite a number of crises myself. The first thing is, and this dovetails very nicely with the previous presentations, this notion of first, you got to be willing to take care of yourself and be prepared for these. And that means, as basic as getting a good sleep, taking care, doing the oxygen mask. The second piece is recognizing that that there's a huge emotional component to this. And the way of navigating that is to understand that 3 or 4 things need to happen in a crisis. First is that there is a deep need for safety. When something bad happens, and this could be losing the basketball game, it could be the final shot that doesn't go in, it could be not being picked for the team, it could be not willing to try out for the team for fear of letting down a parent, right? All of these things, those are mini, mini crises, right? They're not the same as being on the firing line, but what they do is anything that creates anxiety, a higher heart rate, a sense of fear or forbearing, that is a crisis. And in today's world, as we know, when we used to come out of the cave and a saber-toothed tiger would be there, those skills of stress response were super important, as Jim pointed out. Like it's why we're here as a species. But today, now with all of the messages, the social media messages, being bombarded with things that stir up that same kind of fight or flight fear response, it's being tricked. But we're getting the same physiological response, right? So if somebody's afraid, they're afraid of raising their hand in class for getting the answer wrong, or they're afraid to take that shot, we've got to pay attention to that. So the first thing that people need, if we're going to build successful relationships, successful teams that are going to be resilient, is we need to create those safe spaces. And that is one by actually slowing it down and being mindful or present in the idea of like, hey, this is part of our purpose. I need to create space and relationship where people feel safe enough to share. And this would be the same advice I would give a school district that's like, hey, we've got a lot of threats of violence. I'm like, the kids know what's happening. The gap here is the kids don't feel like you're safe enough to tell what's up. So you got to work on your relationships. Maybe a little less technology at the door. You know, it's great that you guys got cameras all the time, but the kids already know what's up. The threat is internal. So you should build the relationships. Well, the threats to your teams, your organizations, your families are internal, and you have to build those relationships there. So that safety is both physical, but more importantly, it's emotional. The second piece is really about proximity. When there's a crisis, we got to get really, really close. There's no way to serve or help someone in crisis without getting up close with them. And that means, again, sort of circling back to this idea of time and space. If we're creating that distance, and that picture was great of the coach sort of lecturing the team as opposed to standing with the team, questioning the team, looking at what the team's perspective might be, that's the same sort of challenge there with proximity. The third piece really has to do with this notion, and Maurice really already pointed this out, this notion of empathy. And empathy starts with listening. And that is a learned, trained, perishable skill, just like anything that you would be working on with strength conditioning. If you're not using it and training it, and there are specific skills, there are specific drills, techniques to become a stronger listener. That could be, in and of itself, an entirely separate lecture. We had a great chat. One of my mentors in the FBI was this guy, Chris Voss. Chris Voss wrote a book, Never Split the Difference. It's sort of an idea that when you're a crisis negotiator, you can't just say, all right, you've got our guy. Well, why don't we just split the difference? You send me half a guy, I'll send you half the money. You know, you have to get somebody returned. And the truth is, we never, if ever, pay ransoms. The vast majority of what's done in crisis communication is just listen. So Maurice, again, is dead on in saying, hey, your first line of defense, your first line of offense in building empathy and building rapport, that you can then influence behavior is about listening. And that takes you to be ready, and it takes you to have created the time, but also building the skill set. It does, again, not happen in a vacuum. And think, too, from the standpoint of if your heart rate is up because somebody said something controversial or provocative to you, how difficult it is for you to listen. So all the more reason for that to be a learned, trained skill. We know that when we are in crisis, when we are afraid, we make the worst decisions. And the data you've seen here now, that if you're alone in crisis and not sleeping and not doing these other things, not only just because you're in crisis, you're making a bad decision, but you're probably missed a few nights of sleep before you're actually interacting around this crisis. A few kind of negotiator sayings. When we talk about empathy and emotions, we have a saying that emotions are universal. You know what it's like to be mad. You know what it's like to be happy, sad, elated, excited, whatever it is. We can all identify with those emotions. What we don't, what is not finite, is stories, is narratives. You don't know what it's like for me to be mad. You don't know what makes me mad, right? You don't know the narrative behind what I am mad over, but you can say, hey, I can tell you're pretty upset. The magic in interpersonal communication is around knowing how I feel about what it is I'm saying to you. I'm sorry, coach, I'm late for practice. Well, I could be sorry, or I could know that that's what I need to say to get through this next thing. So that is the key there, and you cannot separate the emotion there from the content. So that's a key thing in terms of understanding, building empathy and rapport in a crisis. The second thing is that the unexpressed emotion never dies. This is a very famous crisis negotiator saying. So that means when I think back on our firstborn child and I remember that my mother-in-law like barged in on us, and I really resented that. And I've said this 100 times to my wife, and each time she said, you'll have to get over that. I had a chance to express the emotion, but without it being acknowledged. She doesn't have to say that it's true, but what she does have to say is that I understand that really upset you. I can tell that really hurt you, or that would really made you angry. That's enough. She doesn't have to say, and it's so true. Let's go poll 100 people, and 100 people, agree with you. That's not what it is. But so it's really critical to recognize that the unexpressed emotion will come up in another way. And I could give a bunch of examples of that, but we'll save it to time. The last piece is that the most difficult time to address the underlying aspects of a crisis are actually in the crisis. There's no fixing things in the crisis. And if I were to take this to violence, a crisis situation that's actually become violent, the most difficult time to address violence is during violence. It's very costly in terms of life, in terms of resources. Just think of every scenario that we read in the paper about what's happening in the metro area of Chicago. When we address violence through blunt responses or tactical responses, it's really, really difficult. It's bad problem solving. So when we think about trying to resolve crises, sometimes the best thing we could do is to delay the conversation about it. So the beauty of this is like this forum and the information right now is our heart rates are low, we're open, right? Maybe we had a good night's sleep, but this is a great time to come up with the plan for the potential crises that we're going to know they're there. So in this space, Tom, you could probably imagine the crisis for you, I'm going to guess, is parents that bring their kids here with crazy expectations. That's totally predictable. You've probably seen it dozens and dozens of times. You know what's going to happen. Now, what skill set, before that crisis happens, are you going to develop to be able to respond to that so that you have it available when they do yell at you or they say the crazy thing in front of their child, or you can tell that the child is here under duress, training for a sport that they don't want to be training for. That's a crisis. And it's the same skill set that would be deployed in crisis negotiation for you to draw out that, build the relationship, not just with the athlete or the child, but then with the parent. Because we don't, as Maurice rightly pointed out, the empathy, that leads to the rapport. You learn the story, and you hear what's happening with that family, and now you start identifying the trauma. Then it just becomes a question of, do you care enough? If it's not your job, you don't have time for this, if you're not in the business of relationships, then you may not want any more to do with this. But if you do care about the people that you're interacting with as coaches, and the other parents, and the other athletes that are on your children's team, then it's worth thinking about, wow, I could have kind of a social, emotional lens on this. I could have a trauma-informed lens, and whatever behavior I see coming from a student or an athlete or a child, I become curious about. There's something going on behind that behavior. Kids act the way they feel, and there is an appropriate service that your relationship could help deliver them to. Your credibility, your hard work in building that relationship. And it's the same relationship that's going to result in you having influence over their thought process about how they attack training. So the ancillary benefit here is you don't have to do this, but you will not get the team building. You will not get the resilience in the relationship. You will not get the penetrative effect that comes with really building a strong relationship that then allows for all the data points to become